My dad was an old-school surgeon who always wished he was a rancher, and a man who took life by the horns and ran with it. Think John Wayne meets Ernest Hemingway meets Teddy Roosevelt. One thing that always embarrassed me, though, was that if my dad saw something interesting wherever he was, he'd go ask about it. He'd start up impromptu conversations with perfect strangers about crop rotation, cattle genetics, or how to get all those pieces of firewood in the load to stay on top of that one little donkey. I was mortified as a kid. Well, I grew up, and now that's me. I married a perfect man with itchy feet who loves all things music and film, and who makes documentaries just for the love of it. If you dump all of those things into a petri dish and let them stew for 25 years of blissful chaos, what do you get? Well, welcome to my life of vicarious agriculture. Come on along for the ride. All right, so Drew, we've been talking here for half an hour or so, but if you would introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Andrew Conroy. This is Oxwood Farm in Berwick, Maine. My wife and I have been here for 34 years, raised 2 sons on the farm. The farm wasn't their thing, but it's always been mine. My day job is I'm a professor at the University of New Hampshire.
Yes, you are Dr. Drew.
I am Dr. Drew, but most people, don't see me as Dr. Drew. Outside of the university, I go to fairs and take my animals, my oxen, that I've had for decades. And we love our little farm here. It's 16 acres in Berwick. We're surrounded by a river and lots of green grass and green trees.
And sheep,
and
obviously.
We've got a few sheep. They mow the lawn informally.
Well, you also, you spoke about fairs. You met Rick at the Virginia State Fair doing the Devon show. Is that right?
So yes, I've had Devons from the 1990s. In the 1990s, actually, I should go back even further. When I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire, we had a dairy farm, and I would take bull calves and train them as oxen because some neighbors were doing that kind of thing. And I saw these big giant animals, and actually I didn't know as a 7 or 8 year old what they were, but they're just castrated bulls that are trained to work. So when I figured that out, I quickly took some bull calves, castrated them, and tried my hand at oxen. So I was probably 11 or 12 years old when I was playing around with it, and 13 when I started to get serious. So I guess that means for the last 7 years I've been going to fairs with oxen. Maybe I skipped a few years in college. And I've always had oxen. And my thing is I've loved to train them. I mean, some people have said, it's like an art form in a way. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I mean, it's more of a folklore. I hung around with these old ox teamsters and kind of learned the trade from them. The thing I realized when I was about 20 years old is there was really nothing written about how to train oxen.
Well, it's such an old traditional thing, isn't it?
Yes.
This is something that carries forward from generation to generation. So who's going to write it down, right?
Right, and my, since those days as a kid in New Hampshire, I mean, I've been around the world, and people train oxen in Africa, and nobody writes a book about it. It's just something you pass on through the generations. So anyway, I always wanted, as a 13 or 14-year-old, a book about how to train oxen. Can't I just read something? So when I was in college as an undergraduate kind of senior project, I just put down what I had learned. It wasn't really well referenced. It was just me, kind of reflecting back on all that I'd learned, and I wrote that down. And
I want to say the Oxen Guide, is that right?
Well,
okay.
It was called the Oxen Handbook.
The Oxen Handbook, that's it.
And we sold 5,000 copies. So it wasn't a bestseller, but I was, as a 20-year-old, impressed. And so after that, I mean, I did graduate school, and I really hemmed and hawed about what I might do in graduate school, something with animals. And I really thought a lot about oxen, but I mean, I knew there really wouldn't be a job that I could graduate. And so I decided to study dairy cattle and look at specific things related to their health and especially their feet and legs. I was dating my now wife. I knew she wanted to stay in the East Coast. I had interest in everything, sheep and beef cattle, oxen, but I just knew, jobs in the world of oxen would be far and few between. Yeah. So I decided to take my interest in cattle and really focus on dairy cattle, but my focus of my thesis was cows' hooves and the health of their hooves, which actually stemmed from a childhood interest in shoeing oxen. And even my professor, as I was doing my research and talking to farmers and getting data, I would mention shoeing oxen, and he was just like, "What is this shoeing oxen thing?"
But you say, son, you need something that's
Yeah.
actually going to make a living.
So anyway, the lameness in dairy cattle was my thesis, and that ended up, getting me my first job with a master's degree teaching, and I taught at Sterling College in Vermont.
Well, but that's a really important thing. I'm making fun of it
Yeah.
a little bit, but teeth and hooves are the longevity factors, right? You
And
either have them or you
especially-
don't.
And the Holstein is the dominant dairy breed in the United States, and Holsteins, especially in the 90s, no one really studied much about the hooves, but I mean they were falling apart. I mean, we put Holsteins on concrete for their whole life. They need a certain kind of a hoof, and then there were certain hoof health issues.
Now, I just have to stop you there as well. You're one of those people I'm going to have to stop every 2 seconds.
Sure.
So we did go to Penn State and talk to Dr. Liu and Dachau
Yes,
that
I
are
know
doing the
Dachau, yep.
studies on the genetics and the milk
Yep.
production. But now the hoof thing you're talking about, is that a genetic thing because we didn't select for hoof health, or is that a
So in the
conditions?
70s and 80s, you could pick bulls based on their milk production and some other traits, but really the hoof and selecting for the hoof was something that was a bit ignored. I mean, it was recognized certainly by farmers. So anyway, now with genomics and everything else, you can select animals for a certain shape to the hoof, which we know.
Shape.
Yep, a certain shape to the hoof, which we know will help them prevent disease.
Wow.
So in any case, I mean, that interest in cow hooves stemmed from trimming oxen hooves and shoeing oxen. But it did land me my first job, and I taught at this little place called Sterling College up in Craftsbury, not far from Ray Clark. I didn't know Ray at the time, but I guess he would have been there. And I taught for a couple of years there. And what that place did, that wonderful little college, was kind of my teacher training, but they allowed me to have a team of oxen. So, I mean, on the campus, Andrew Conroy brought in some oxen, and they still have oxen there today. So
Yeah,
36 years later, Sterling College still uses oxen as part of their program.
And that's their perks to draw people in, right? Health insurance, 401k,
And
oxen.
you can keep a pair of oxen. So yeah, Sterling College is a really unique environmental agricultural school, but they do things, organically and kind of sometimes non-traditionally. But they've really, for decades now, kept oxen and draft horses and let the students use them and work with them and train them.
But again, I'm making fun of that, but that there is a lot to that thing where academics, that's why you're in that realm, because you're interested in things and you're learning more about it. And if you truly want to stay on the up and coming edge of what's taught, you really do have to have a little bit of a practical basis for that, and that might be a daily trek out to the back field, right?
So for me, that's been my life. I mean, if I didn't have the practical part, I wouldn't have enjoyed any of my teaching. I mean, I'm very practical. My students would tell you that. I teach really hands-on stuff. I'm not a philosophical professor or a theoretical professor that digs deep into the statistics, but I love teaching. I love sharing what I know with students, and that's paid off really well for me. I mean, I have a lot of classes. I teach a lot of classes and a lot of students, but now 36 years later, I have so many students that are running farms around New England. And even yesterday, my wife and I went out for lunch with some friends, and I said, how about we go for ice cream at one of my former students' dairy farms that started an ice cream shop. So I've really tried to keep my hands, dirty. I have my own little farm here. But at the same time, I mean, in the winter when it's cold, I like being in the classroom rather than, freezing out on a tractor somewhere.
Yeah, but it is a critical component that you stay on the ground. We can select a lot with genes.
Yep.
But you have to know the conditions of that you're looking for, correct? You can't just say, maybe hooves are important, let's pick that out. You have to know that there's an issue in order to pursue that particular thing.
Sure.
So is there a lag in the realm between the education and then the practical application and then the research and then, hey, we need this thing? Because that could be a 20-year span, right? Because if you're going to an academic to say, how can we do this thing? How can we go to the genetics department and pull that particular trait that we need? You have to identify it, but then you have to have that next generation out there to. Do you understand kind of what I'm asking?
So I mean, one of the things that we do well in the United States is we have dairy farmers or beef farmers or any kind of farmer. It doesn't matter if you're growing corn or soybeans or almonds, and we usually have someone at the university who does extension work. So, and again, I'm not a dairy extension specialist or cooperative extension person. Those people act as the intermediary between the farmer and the academics who do the research and push things forward. So I've often worked with cooperative extension. I do a lot with 4-H, and that is part of cooperative extension. So anyway, the cooperative extension is this arm of the university that really does a great job, helping farmers maybe figure out how to interpret the research, but also reporting back, like, all the farmers are talking about this thing. So the cow hoof thing, was there a lag? Sure there was. I mean, we knew there were hoof diseases. Farmers for years have had to treat hoof diseases. But it took, some time for people to realize we can select bulls for certain hoof shapes and predict how much a certain bull will transfer that to its offspring. And that's just one. So it's not only hoof shape, it's leg shape. And that made a difference. I mean, it really has made a difference in the way that dairy cattle are bred today, especially Holsteins.
Okay, so I'm going to make that sexist comment here. Everybody talks about bulls with the characteristics. The cows get lost. Is that just because it's easier to transport semen than it is to, or is it something truly where I think the good doctors at Penn State were mentioning that the bulls put out cows that produced milk. So you actually were wanting the bulls as the critical component.
Well, if we have 9 million dairy cows in the United States, 9 million plus, we have far fewer bulls. Artificial insemination, we can draw semen from a bull. We can get 300 to 500 units, per every time they draw semen from the bull. You do that 3-4 days a week. So, I mean, a bull in a year of his life can produce enough semen to breed tens of thousands of cows. Yeah. So he has a huge influence.
It's just mechanics.
Actually, that has been the detriment of some of our breeds, which can lead us to, other discussions we want to have about rare breeds. So the Holstein, there have been certain lines that have produced so much milk, and through artificial insemination, everyone wants to use that bull, and we have inbreeding as a problem.
Two in the 60s, right? There were 2 bulls, and pretty much almost all of the pools, my understanding, is about 100 right now.
Right.
It's an endangered animal, the Holstein.
So it's not endangered, but it's an inbred animal. So it thinking about the other breeds that I've been involved in. So most of my career has been working with dairy cattle. I have experience with sheep and goats and beef cattle and swine, but most of my career has been with dairy cattle. So I'm very familiar, and I teach that. But the other part of my life, my personal life, and a little bit of my professional life has been working with rare breeds. And I would say I was introduced to the rare breeds in the 1980s at Sterling College. And in fact, there was a guy who was a dairy farmer not far from the campus who raised Dutch belts. And I had seen Dutch belts, but he really convinced me. He was a member of ALBC, brought me into his farm, talked to me about, why it was important, and I'd never really thought about that. In my academic training, growing up on a farm with Holsteins and Jerseys, hadn't really thought about rare breeds, except as a kid, I always admired people who had Devons for oxen.
Is that a common thing? I mean, were they everywhere?
So in the 70s, it wasn't common, but that's what made them so unique. So people had milking shorthorns, and people had Holsteins that they were using as oxen, and some people had Jerseys or Herefords, but some few folks had Devons. And as a boy with my pair of brown Swiss, I was just intrigued by this little breed that obviously acted different, and I hadn't thought much about it since. I mean, one of the things that I realized as a kid is, like, we didn't have Devons. We didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have a lot of resources to pursue finding a team. But I always, in the back of my head, thought, these are really interesting. And it wasn't until the 1980s at Sterling College and this guy named Paul Daniels was Mr. Dutch Belt, I got to thinking about the importance of these rare breeds, like Dutch Belts, like milking Devons, like American linebacks, and so forth. And he really did make me think about that. And I bought my first pair of Dutch Belts from him. And they actually, their names were Ben and Chaz. They came from Irisburg, Vermont. I had them at Sterling College in the 1987, 88, 89 school year. And we brought them here to Berwick. And actually that pair of Dutch Belts logged our property to build this barn.
Isn't that an amazing
that
thing?
That pair of Dutch Belts pulled stones out of here to build the stone walls that you park next to with your car. So we really enjoyed those Dutch Belts. But in the back of my mind, I still admired these Devons. So again, it was the early 1990s, and I had the chance to buy some Devons from a guy in Vermont that was dispersing his herd. And we sold the Dutch Belts, and I had a little money, So I bought a pair of bull calves, and I bought a heifer from this man named Howard Mansfield. And Howard Mansfield lived up near what is now Ben and Jerry's in Waterbury, Vermont. And we brought them here, and I kind of fell in love with them. I mean, the Devons are a different breed, and first of all, they're not really big. They're really animals that, thrive. And just for example, if we look out at my field here, I have some, grass of different sorts, some tall fescue, some orchard grass, some Kentucky bluegrass. And I have my 2 oxen here that are not really grazing because they don't think this is the most appetizing stuff. The Devons that I had, this would be grubbed down like a lawn. And Ray Clark often said to me, a Devon can get fat on a flat rock. Well, the Devons really have this zest for life and zest for everything. I mean, whether they're grazing or walking or working, everything is like 110%. Now, I've got my little cattle dog here. Hey, Rex. Cattle dog to me is a bit like a Devon. They give 110% all the time. And the Devons to me, in the 1990s when we got them, I quickly realized they were different. And they fit this little farm because we don't have a lot of land. We have 16 acres. We've got some small pastures and paddocks. And they really helped me reclaim this land because we logged our forest. I had this small field and another one up above that was forest. But the Devons, without a tractor, without any mechanical equipment, we cleared the land and established the grassland. But the Devons would eat every weed. They eat every bush. And the other cattle I have, whether it be brown Swiss or Holsteins or whatever, yeah, they like to eat grass, but they're pretty picky about it.
But they'll go to the trees too, correct?
Well, right over here where I have this little shed, there's a small paddock, and that was forest. So I did clear the trees out of there, but after the Devons stripped all the bark off the trees. I mean, they literally, my other cattle don't do that. They rub against the tree. The Devons would literally, like a moose in the winter, just strip the bark off the trees. So I wanted to clear the land anyway, but the Devons made sure that was going to happen.
That characteristic alone, I would think, would be one of the reasons they might bring them here originally.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then having that pair of little Devon calves and having this heifer that we called Emily. We had her for 15 years. That's the other great thing about Devons. I work with Holsteins. Our oldest Holstein at the University of New Hampshire is about 10 years old. The average age of animals is 5 or 6. They produce a lot of milk. But like I say, it's like a big dog. Big dogs don't live as long as smaller dogs. The Devons are really tough, and they live a long time. And this cow of ours, Emily, she lived to be 15 and had 12 calves in her lifetime. And she would have had 13, but I screwed up one year and didn't get her bred. So, I mean, the Devons were an animal that could eat anything, survive on minimal feed, and they just had a power and zest, and especially in the yoke. That's what I quickly found out with the Devons that I trained. That was my first pair in the 90s. They move faster. They watch you. They're really, really smart. And again, I liken it. I like Australian cattle dogs because they're smart. They're right there with you, and they pay attention, and Devons are the same way.
Now, I also hear from John Hall, actually, he was saying they are athletes. If you can keep up with a Devon all day, you are an athlete because they just go and go and go. Is that right?
It's absolutely true. So I can tell you, I've had brown Swiss. Brown Swiss are kind of the opposite of Devons. Some people will say they're dumb. They're not. They're the only animals I've ever had on this farm, and every pair I've had of brown Swiss oxen have escaped. We have a river down below our little paddock. On a hot day, the brown Swiss would just go through the fence and be sitting in the river. Never one time did the Devons ever get out. So again, it's interesting, like the brown Swiss, but then back to how they move. The brown Swiss are these big, giant things that really generally move slow. And I love them in part because they had a temperament that was really easygoing. But for me, the Devons were a bit of a challenge. And
like the cattle dog,
yeah,
right?
I mean, you've got to work hard with them and you've got to pay attention. So as smart as they are, they'll also do this. And I love to show this as a Devon. When a Devon is thinking you're working them in the woods, you're getting ready to hitch to a log, if they start doing this, you know you're in trouble because they're probably going to run off.
It sounds like
and
a 4-year-old.
they're not going to run off like a scared horse. They're going to figure out, which way am I going to go because I'm tired of this. Now, a brown Swiss, I don't even see them doing that. And then I have other cattle, like right now I have these Kerry cattle. Irish Kerry cattle, they're like horses. Like a deer runs by and they flip their heads up in the air and run away. So the Devons, I never saw them as scaredy cats. The Devons are really steady, really smart, but fast. So back to the athletic thing. I was training a young pair of Devon calves, and I ran by the house, and my wife said, "What are you, like Indiana Jones? I see this flash go by," and she goes, and this sled like going sideways. I'm like, "Well, I'm training my Devons." "You're not a young kid anymore." So yeah, but once you get them trained, I really do love them. I probably had 6 or 7 different teams, and they all were wonderful. I mean, and really solid animals you could depend on, and they'd give you everything. Again, like my Australian cattle dog, who just whatever I ask of him, he does. But there's part of him that's so independent, I have to know that and know how to work with that.
But you have quite a broad spectrum, because if I'm not mistaken, milking shorthorns are the big
Holsteins
cattle,
and
aren't
Brown
they?
Swiss are bigger.
They're big.
But milking shorthorns were the mainstay of oxen in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they were bigger than Devons.
But so you've got this big steady cow, and then you've got this smaller, short, really quick athletic cow, and then the Kerrys that you have here, it's my understanding they're jumpers too. Is that right? They'll jump a fence. I've heard that from some people.
But they've been shocked pretty well, so they're pretty well fence broken. But we could go in and meet them.
So you've worked with all kinds of cattle, especially oxen.
Right, and that's been, for me, that's my passion. I mean, I've written a book about how to train oxen and written, 2 more and produced videotapes. So for me, it's a bit of an experiment to try the different breeds and try to understand them. I haven't had every single breed. I mean, there are lots and lots of breeds of cattle, and some of them we don't use as oxen. I mean, if they don't have horns, we really don't even let them compete. So the horns are part of the culture of, you have a team of oxen, we want them to have horns.
Now explain that to me. That's a super interesting thing, because people just think it's a sort of an ornamental thing or just for protection, but explain the role of the horns in the oxen world, please.
So for, oxen that wear a yoke, our oxen wear what I call a neck yoke or a bow yoke. So they wear this wooden bow around their neck that connects to the yoke on top of their neck. And if the oxen are going down a really steep hill, or if they were backing up a wagon, they actually tip their heads back and use their horns to help hold the load. So their yoke is very simple. A horse has a harness, a horse has a britchin that goes around their rump, but now it's really a cultural thing. So there's no reason you couldn't show oxen at a fair without horns, but we have these rules at the fairs that, that's something that is what we want culturally for our oxen.
Well, it's a breed standard, and often this is one of those things that I keep finding very interesting, is the difference between today's norms and the old school breeding characteristics. If you look at I'm just going to give you the Highland cattle. Yeah. So they're furry, fuzzy ones. You go to a show, they're shaving them now.
I saw a former pair of my Highland cattle yesterday. So I had a pair of Highland oxen.
Did you really?
Yeah. And again, why did I do it? I just wanted to try them. I wanted to test them out, see their temperament. The one thing, they were very smart, but the one thing I didn't like about them is I do most of my work with my oxen in the summer. Mm-hmm. And it's mostly because I'm a college professor and I have, summers are my free time. And they have all that long hair. So they are very interesting, because unless I shaved all their hair off, they really struggle to work in the summer. They really struggle to, it's like, trying to do work with a wool coat. So these guys, these little Kerrys that I have here, I have shaved all their hair off, and part of it's just to make them more comfortable. So anyway, I always thought if I had the Highlands and I shaved their hair off, nobody would even know what they were. But they were fine, and I sold them to a man, and I just saw them yesterday. They're 10 years old. I sold them as 2-year-olds. This is Lorcan.
Yeah, Lorcan's a very sociable creature.
Well,
actually,
Liam is usually more sociable, but Lorcan's just curious here. What are you doing, Lorcan?
Now, this actually brings up a point. When you have animals that you're going to be working with constantly, this is actually a good thing to have them be used to people, correct?
Absolutely. No, and these two especially, it depends. A lot of working with oxen depends how they've been acclimated to people. So I have purchased animals that are 6 months or more, never been touched by a human, and they are a challenge. These two have been handled since birth. In fact, the one behind, his name is Liam. I brought him home in the back seat of my truck. No, they've been handled and worked with a lot.
Obviously not.
Stop. Hey, I didn't say anything, so you stop. Sit.
But to go back to the horn thing, I mean, this is a beautiful characteristic of that animal. I mean, it's gorgeous. Horns are beautiful, but they're purposeful.
So these guys, I mean, are new to me. I mean, I've had them for 2.5 years, got them as small calves. I bought 3. I often buy 3 bull calves when I want to make a team, and I don't care if they're Devons or Brown Swiss or Holsteins.
Just in case tragedy occurs?
Well,
or?
sometimes tragedy. If you buy, a bull calf from a dairy farm, you're bottle feeding them. If it's winter, they might get pneumonia. The other thing is they could, break a horn off or whatever. So I bought 3 of these, Liam, Larry, and Lorcan. And I decided these 2 had a temperament that was just much nicer to work with. Mm-hmm. Larry and cattle, like dogs, like people, have different temperaments. Part of it could be related to their early handling or whatever. But I handled them all from a young age. But Larry was just a grump. Like every time I tried to do anything with him, he didn't want to do it. So these 2 are just far more easy to work with. So Larry left the farm, and Larry's now hamburger somewhere. But Liam and Lorcan, I think, will be around for a while.
Now, that you don't just have to worry about the personalities meshing. You also have to kind of get them the same general size. Is that right?
Yeah, so the 3 that I bought, Liam, Larry, and Lorcan, were all brothers. Same sire, a bull in the field bred all the cows. So they were all the same dad, but the differences, I mean, again, you could have differences between a pure sibling. But by keeping them genetically similar, you hope they're the same size. That's important with oxen. If you have a big one and a small one, they struggle to work. For me, I show them, so I want them to look as much alike as possible, not only the size, but their heads, their horns, and there are differences. I mean, his horns are a little different. I tried to reshape them a little bit.
You put weights on them too,
well, you can do all sorts of
Yep.
things. But I was a little getting carried away, worried. Sometimes they just droop. So anyway, he's got little holes in his horns where I had some weights on him, but I was worried they were going to just drop down. So they're close enough in their horn shape. They do look a little different. All right, Mr. Man.
Boy, they're beautiful cattle.
Yeah, so the Kerrys are different. I mean, I've really had probably more pairs of Devons than any oxen I've had. What I like about these, similar to Devons, is they're not a big breed.
Now there's a bone across the top here. It's nice that I have this close-up view here. There's a bone across the top. Is that what holds it back, or is that actually coming against the front here?
Well, if you look, the horns actually extend behind. That's called the pole of the head, and the horns are actually behind it, so the yoke will hit the back of the horns first.
Thank you so much for training him to come up here.
If they back up a wagon, again, rather than have it smash up on their pole and their skin, they use their...
So now this brings me back to a little bit about the show and your judging, and this is important. Yep. I remember the Virginia show. They had you come in and judge the milking Devons. Explain to me, please, because I have a theory on this. But explain to me how the judges impact the breed and what gets bred and how much gets the breeders get for their cattle for years after the show.
Yeah. So, at a fair, an agricultural show or whatever, we're visually evaluating the animals. Mm-hmm. So for eons, that was the only way you could pick a bull or a cow. You would look at it. Maybe you knew something about the mother that was a good milk producer. Maybe there was some milk production data that a farmer wrote down on a piece of paper. Now we have all this genetic information. We can actually genomically, pull a hair out of their tail head, send it off, and that little piece of hair with some skin on it can give us a genetic test that tells you exactly what this animal is, what genes they're going to transmit. So back to the show ring judging. So show ring judging is a little bit archaic, in that we've been doing that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We picked a cow that we liked the way it looked, and we bred it to the bull. We liked the way that looked. There's a lot of unknowns there, but like I just said, as we look at my cattle, which again are Kerrys, there's a certain look I like to an ox. I want them, and I don't care what breed they are, Brown Swiss, Devon, Kerrys, I want them to stand on good feet and legs. Okay, we talked about the hooves in dairy cattle. I want them to stand up on their feet, not leaned back like a German Shepherd. And I say this to my students. I want them to stand squarely. So if we look at this guy front on, I want their front legs to be square underneath them, not knock-kneed. So I just know having an animal with good feet and legs helps them travel. So with oxen, it's critical. But with dairy cows, we've realized you can't ignore that. They're living on concrete, which is really hard on their feet and legs. If they stand squarely on their feet and legs, on a set of hooves that are upright, they're going to live longer, they're going to have fewer problems. So in any case, there are some things we look at that we just know through experience, like the feet and legs and the moving. And again, if we think about any other animal or even a person, if a person like my dog limping a little bit, you immediately saw that my dog has a little limp, that's a problem. So we don't want cattle to have legs that are going to, So that's something, again, what did I do for my master's degree? I studied cow feet and legs. So I know for me, even dairy cattle owners that I've judged their cattle at fairs, you're a feet and leg guy. I am. I mean, in part because that's my training. But there's other characteristics we know that are important. Again, you can genomically test an animal. Maybe they're going to be the greatest animals for milk production. But what about their feet and legs?
Now, how true is that? Is that 100% across the board? If the genetics say this, that animal is that fundamentally and will transmit that? Or is it sometimes what you see in the genome is not going to be quite the same thing?
Absolutely. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I know through just what they're doing with people, Ancestry.com, it's been fascinating to me to see my heritage, because I thought I was 75% Irish, 25% Italian, but my genetics are not that. I'm like 87% Irish when I don't understand how that could be. But genes separate and mix. So especially you test the genomics of one animal, but then you're breeding it to another animal and you don't know how those genes are going to mix.
Yeah.
So my brother, he refuses to be tested for Ancestry.com, but I would love to see him tested because he has a darker complexion and black hair, which I know, or I think I know. Again, visually, it seems like he has more of the Italian side.
Yeah.
So with cattle, it's a lot like that. So genetics, when they mix, you don't always know exactly what you're going to get. However, by genetically testing, you predispose. You have more information than just looking.
So you need to really test every single animal that you are going to show in order to truly back it up.
Is that what you're saying? The other part of it is there's certain animals, even though a cow might produce a huge amount of milk, we want a cow with a straight top line. We know that they're going to carry a calf. The calf is in the middle of their belly. It pulls down on them. My cow, Emily, that had 13 calves. 13 years she was pregnant, and if she had started out with a crooked back, it would be exaggerated after carrying 13 calves. So I like animals to have straight lines, a straight top line, stand square on their feet and legs. And for me, that's part of my interest in oxen. But I know even with dairy cattle or beef cattle, we don't want to see top lines that are dipping and legs that are crisscrossing. We just know that's important. Then the other part is the head. We want a head we know, in fact, years ago they used to say a dairy cow with a longer face produces more milk. Was that true, tested genomically or whatever? We do know that dairy cattle tend to have longer, leaner faces than beef cattle, and they produce more milk. So again, there's some folks that would really say, well, absolutely, you can tell. I'm a professor. I'm not a geneticist, but I do know genomics tells you far more than what I could look at. But I like looking at cattle. I like visually evaluating them, and I judge oxen, and I judge beef cattle, and I judge dairy cattle at fairs. I'm ready for more coffee.
I say we go back on back.